Welcome to Text Support, a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ, where we encourage and equip people to interact with the biblical text. We are your hosts, Tim Martin and Brian LeMaster.
Welcome back. If you are a regular listener, Tim and I encourage you to share this with a friend or maybe somebody else that you worship with. We want this to be a resource for as many people as possible. So if you find it a blessing to you, go ahead and pass it along to somebody else. We are jumping back in to our series, The One They Call Christ. I'm excited for this episode today because it's really a category that, or a topic that I haven't spent too much time actually studying. I don't think I've ever studied it in isolation. Yeah, obviously it gets mentioned sometimes when you're going through different gospels, but not really just to look down and to say, okay, what do we know about the family of Jesus? And Tim, I think it'd be best if we start maybe with his past. Let's kick it off with the genealogies over in Matthew. What jumps out to you about how the gospel or how the New Testament kicks off the way we have it in English?
Well, you know, we'll look at Luke here in just a little bit. And so Matthew starts right off the bat, and it's interesting that his genealogy begins literally by saying the book of Genesis of Jesus Christ. The book, and literally in Greek, it's the Biblios Genesios. It is the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ, of the son of David, the son of Abraham. And so that's the same word in Greek that we use for the Greek version of the Old Testament book, Genesis. And so it's the book of the beginnings of Jesus Christ. I think in some ways, Matthew's marking a new beginning here, and it gives some credibility to Christ in the same way that John does, beginning his gospel, is crediting Christ as being at creation, always has been, was the agent of creation. And we'll see in Luke kind of takes the reverse. He starts with Jesus and works his way back all the way to Adam, calling Adam the son of God. Matthew has an interesting arrangement here of listing these people. Both of them leave people out of the genealogies, but Matthew's interesting in he tries to group them, and it's kind of hard to, and we'll talk about that in a minute, in groups of the number 14, between Abraham and David, between David and the exile, and in between exile and Jesus, as these major historical markers in the history of the Jewish people and the Israelites. And so it really stands out to me in that way. And also that he includes 4 women here.
Tim, before
actually,
you
4 named women, 5 women in total.
Before you keep going, is there something special about the number 14, or why choose that structure when he's picking who to include and who not?
Other than a multiple of 7, I'm not really entirely sure why that is. I read a couple of different people on it just to kind of see if there was some general idea about that and what the significance of that is. And other than it being a multiple of 7, which is, I don't think necessarily something we see as predominant in the Gospels as we do, say, for example, in John's Apocalypse, in Revelation. But I think there is some significance to it in the way that he says that, and there's probably some different opinions out there, but I do not know. If you've run across something, I'm open to. This is the first study of the genealogies I've ever done when we're getting prepared for this. I'm like everybody else. I just blow right by them. But I've come to realize there's a reason not to, and I'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah. I read one thing, I won't comment too far on there, that even maybe the name David had something to do with some of the it got way over my head, and I just
did see something
on.
About
but I was just
David
like, that's
in
way
Hebrew
too much
just,
of how they wrote and did things in Hebrew.
David in Hebrew is just David. You know, you don't have the A and the I that we have in vowels in English. But yeah, I did see something in a Hebrew gematria, which is using Hebrew numbers Hebrew letters to represent numbers, that the sum of the numbers of the letter of his name equal 14, which perhaps his audience would have picked up on that. I don't know. To me, it's kind of like calculating the number of the beast. I ain't real sure.
Yeah.
I ain't real sure
I didn't
anybody
finish that article.
That anybody
like,
had
okay.
the wisdom to be able to calculate that, as John wrote down.
Yeah, you referenced this. I do think it's interesting who is chosen to be included on this list. Like when you think of somebody like Rahab and Ruth and just the narratives that we have and the uniqueness of how they come into the story of the Bible, like especially somebody like Rahab, and then to be highlighted here, to me, I think is important. I also think it's interesting that the deportation to Babylon is mentioned, just like when you think of all the unknowns and the hurt in the Old Testament, like God was still working his plan, even though the people at that time couldn't see it. So it's interesting to look back and to see okay, God accomplished his promise that he gave that goes all the way back to Abraham, even though there was some disobedience and highs and lows through that, like God still accomplished what he set out to do.
Yeah, and the Rahab is challenging because for that to be Rahab of Jericho, she's out of order by many, many decades, if not centuries, because it says Rahab is the mother of Boaz. Well, that ain't the same Rahab that the spies ran into, because we're talking about a great deal of time later. Some, though, think that it's a woman of similar name or that it's just out of time. That it is Rahab the prostitute. Now, certainly Tamar has a checkered story when we think about her. That's not primarily not her fault, but she having that, and also Ruth being mentioned. If it is the Rahab of Jericho, we're talking about a Canaanite. Ruth was a Moabitess. I mean, we have people, I think Tamar may have even been listed as not of Israelite descent. I can't remember that for sure. We have the unmentioned name of Bathsheba here because it just says in verse 6, the wife of Uriah. It doesn't mention her by name, which is very interesting that it chooses not to mention her by name. And then I think it just says Mary. It calls it Mary, Joseph, the husband of Mary. There we see these women mentioned here, which is unusual and I think important, but also just showing that Jesus, like you said, he didn't come from, everybody in his stock. And all these kings mentioned after Solomon were terrible people. A lot of them were terrible people. We may have Josiah and Hezekiah that were pretty good.
Yeah, I like Hezekiah.
But Rehoboam was a bum. He was a real terrible king, and a lot of these guys were terrible kings. Manasseh was the worst. He's described as the worst king ever of Judah. So, but Jesus, he didn't have his past. To me, it's interesting that Matthew does this, and so does Luke. You wouldn't do this if it was not for a purpose, and list these people who are of very, very questionable ethical and moral standing in this lineage of a man you're revering as God, if there wasn't a purpose to it.
So, Tim, what do you think the purpose is that Matthew has and what he's structuring here?
Well, I certainly think Matthew, he starts off with saying this is the beginning, or the book of the beginning of Jesus Christ, the Christ, the Son of David, and giving him legitimacy. I think both of these give legitimacy to Christ. With Luke going past, Matthew just goes back to Abraham. Luke goes all the way back to Adam, describing him as the Son of God. And of course, everybody's a son of Adam, eventually when we think about that. But I think it's legitimacy. A comment that I saw in Joel Green's commentary on Luke, but I think is very applicable to Matthew's reasoning as well. He says, in thinking about the world that we live in, we're thinking about these genealogies are something we tend to skip over because they're not really all that important to us. But they obviously were important to the target audiences of Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel,
Mm-hmm.
or else they wouldn't have been included. And Luke's is in a completely different place. It's right as Jesus was starting his ministry when it says he's 30 years old, and then all of a sudden Matthew inserts this genealogy here. And thinking about the original context, I think this was well said, that in a lineage or descent-based status system like that into which Jesus was born, genealogy served the crucial function of determining membership in a given kinship group. They give indicators of inherited status, is what Joel Green says. And I think that's important for us to remember. And that has theological and apologetic issues to it. And I think he's right in saying that this gives in 1980s hip hop language, Jesus is legit. I mean, he is legitimate.
We just lost some listeners there.
But he is legit. He is a legitimate descendant of David, deserves to sit on the throne, is a son of God, and comes from a royal lineage. And all that is important to the ancient reader. And it may not be as important to us because we are not necessarily looking for someone to sit on the throne of David and to have that royal descent. But I think both of these cases, they are legitimizing who Jesus is.
Yeah, to them, that was built upon the promise. To us, it's just, do we trust Jesus? So definitely a different target for us. One thing that I always had heard was Matthew leans into more of a Jewish audience, or this is one of the reasons it gives that, as most likely Matthew leans a little bit Jewish, because he stops at Abraham and
Gotcha.
seems to focus on building that, where Luke seems to have a wider audience in mind. Is one of the things I've regularly heard about it.
Yeah.
All right, let's jump into a couple of difficulties, if that's good with you, Tim.
I love difficulties.
All right, so when we think about Matthew, and you referenced this earlier, but they don't match. Like, so walk us through. I know you said they kind of pick and choose, but in some instances, like especially when you think of like Joseph's father, like how do we reconcile two different names being mentioned there? And what do we make of this?
Yeah, I haven't looked. You talking about Joseph's father, Jacob, in Matthew's account, and then what does he give over in Luke?
In Luke, I can't actually recall it.
Yeah. There are also some things left out
with an H.
And the numbers. Like, for example, in Matthew, if you actually count in that first grouping, yes, there are 14 people named from Abraham to David. In the second grouping, you have to leave David's name out and then group 14. And then in the last grouping of things, you have to rename Jeconiah in the listing to get to 14. Or you have 13, including Jeconiah. And so it's interesting how he says 14, but if you try to count them all, there's a little bit of challenge to that. What were you saying was he was saying Joseph's dad's name was Jacob or Jacob.
And Luke, it's Heli.
Heli.
Yeah, however you would.
Yeah, I don't know enough about if there's a relationship between that name and the name Jacob or Jacob.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know if you had looked into that much.
I had looked at the omission of a couple of kings in the list, and really some of these time periods are huge to only have 14 generations. And so we know there has to be a reason that Matthew selected 14. And I say selected, I mean, I know he was led by the Holy Spirit, but there has to be a purpose of that. And it's interesting to me that it says deportation to Babylon, not destruction of the temple, because destruction of the temple is the more important historical event. Not all the Jews were deported to Babylon. As a matter of fact, only a few thousand of them were deported to Babylon. So it's interesting he says that instead of those two things. But what were you thinking?
Well, I don't have an answer to it, but
why not?
Well, maybe in a few years if I just studied this. But
that's right.
One thing I talked about was maybe the royal succession versus a physical descent. Royal being more Matthew, like, and Luke doing the other one. Possibly like a second marriage in there. Another person referenced there's the possibility, and they gave some like different examples of these, like in the Old Testament, of tracing genealogies. But the other one was the possibility of no male in Mary's family. So maybe they moved to Joseph as opposed to like Mary. So there's a lot of different variables that can come into play in how you count genealogies based on unique situations that occur. Like, because, typically you would trace it through males, but if there's not a male, you have to do it other ways and stuff. Yeah. So anyway, so I don't have an answer to that, but
it's the Heli is of Hebrew origin in this. Of course, we got to remember son of does not always mean the born son of. It may be a descendant of that. And so I'd have to go back. But yeah, his kind of Joseph, the lineage of Joseph, even his grandfather is a different name there. And so that would be interesting to look at. Yeah, is it looking at Mary or is it?
Yeah, because some think maybe it's tracing Mary, but then there's some difficulties with some of that. So, anyways, I thought it was worth it just letting people know that it's there, and there's not really a great answer for some of that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's somebody out there who thinks they have the perfect answer to that.
Yeah,
probably didn't.
All right. Before everybody falls asleep, you ready to move past?
Yeah, let's talk about this family.
All right, let's talk about maybe parents. Let's start with Joseph.
Okay. Joseph, he was just Jesus' father in a family situation. He obviously wasn't Jesus' biological father. Jesus' biological father, quote unquote, is the Holy Spirit who impregnated her. One of the things I think we should start off with is in remembering that in this entire narrative, Jesus is a human being. And I don't know that all the things that we're going to talk about were included to prove that purpose, but it is an underlying thing that Jesus had real brothers and sisters. He had a mother, a human mother. And as far as his family system, he had a human dad. And so I think that's amazing. His mother had cousins or relatives, if you will, in Elizabeth. And so it's one of those things that makes me stop and realize there's never an attempt not to paint Jesus as a human being by these gospel writers. That's just included, just as if they were talking about Peter and his family, and his mother-in-law, for example. It's just amazing to me that we have that. And so, yeah, we do have Joseph, and kind of we look in Mark chapter 6, verse 3, and in Matthew 13:55, Jesus is described as one of two things: Jesus the carpenter, or Jesus the son of the carpenter, by people who locally know him. He's in Nazareth when this takes place. And so they're like, what is this guy doing? Isn't this the son of the carpenter? Oh, this is not a son of a rabbi or some, prominent Sadducee or something along those lines. And Mark is the one, I think, that says Jesus was a carpenter. And of course, that's traditionally what people always think. However, there are some textual variants that say the carpenter's son. I don't think there's any big deal there, because it would be very typical for a father to teach his son his trade, probably working as early as the age of 12 or on the onset of puberty, working in the family business. And that word means woodworker. I know we think about carpenter, somebody who builds cabinets or does woodworking, some sort of woodworking. He maybe built furniture, whatever that may wind up being for houses. I saw somewhere where he was probably very busy in nearby Sepphoris, which is a very growing and bustling community, whereas Nazareth was more of a village of sorts. And so we don't know a lot about Joseph. He kind of disappears after the infancy narratives, and most people think he probably passed away. It wouldn't be untypical for him to be quite a bit older than Mary. And in a world without antibiotics, life expectancy can be pretty brief. And so it appears that he died at least by the time Jesus was crucified, but he does disappear from the narrative pretty early.
Yeah. And one thing I saw where, it had been based on how his character's described, it would have been rare for him just to abandon the family.
That would be your
So logically he passes here, especially for the way that Jesus talks about Mary at the cross. Of making sure she's taken care of, all of that points to him no longer being alive and stuff.
Yeah, Jesus is. If Joseph is dead, Jesus is the head of the family.
Yes,
because he's the oldest born male, and so he hands off the care of his mother. It appears to John.
Yeah, which also creates a unique thought there as well. As if Jesus the head of his family, what does that do with the tensions of his brothers when he starts this ministry?
Yeah,
if they think, oh, well, you should be doing X, Y, and Z.
You've abandoned that road. They're living in Capernaum by the time he's doing ministry. They're no longer living in Nazareth, it appears in the text, or at least they have some kind of home in Capernaum. And so, or they're staying in Capernaum at least, because there's some interaction with his family there. And so, it is. Is Jesus abandoning his role as the head of the family there and going off and doing this crazy stuff where it's not earning any income for the family or taking care of them? So I can understand some animosity, if not jealousy. There's certainly some apocryphal infancy books about Jesus that have Jesus behaving all crazy when he was a child, but those are non-canonical nonsense.
Tim, do you make anything of Luke 2:24 when they go to make the offering there, that they have not the lamb but the birds? I read one thing where it talked about that most likely Jesus was from a family that was lower income because they didn't offer the lamb there. But I also thought, well, maybe they just, if customs got away from what they should have been offering or not. But everything I read pointed to that.
No, there's provision for you to offer, especially if you're poor. Remember, if you don't have any land for your sheep to graze on, or you can't pay a shepherd to take care of your sheep.
Oh, yeah.
Joseph wasn't a shepherd.
Yeah.
And so,
but they seem religious where they wouldn't just be purposely trying to get around that. So, Torah, based on
Torah,
Leviticus,
right.
Leviticus 12 talks about
that.
That. So, most likely he's from not a wealthy family as well, based on what they offer there.
About everybody we read about in the New Testament is not from a wealthy family. So maybe Paul and some other these fishermen, everybody. Jesus was with what we would call a very blue collar group of people. But I don't think there's anything negative about that. It's Torah obedience.
Oh yeah. Still faithful, but most likely, indicates where they are financially. Anything else about Joseph before we jump over to?
Nah, but we just don't know much about it. He's got a good name, famous Israelite. There, he gets a name. Oddly enough, Joseph of the Old Testament is never mentioned in the New Testament, I don't think. And so maybe in the Hall of Faith, I don't remember. But yeah, that we really don't know a lot about Joseph. He seems like a good guy. He seems like a good guy.
All right, for Mary, big talking point there.
There's been a lot. There's been a lot of manufacture about Mary by certain Christian traditions that doesn't make any sense. You and I talked the other day about people think Mary was a perpetual virgin, which is not anywhere in the biblical text. We can get to that. She had other children. There's nobody in the ancient world that read these books and didn't think that these brothers and sisters the brothers are listed, the sisters are not by name, were not Mary's children. I mean, there's nobody that reads that in the ancient world that thinks, well, she was a perpetual virgin, so these have to be stepchildren or adopted children. I mean, that's just utter nonsense. I mean, I don't try to be too insulting of people's religious beliefs, but that's made up and it's manufactured by taking a theological belief and pushing it back into the Bible. And so there's no reason to think she was a virgin when she had Jesus, and that's all that matters. She doesn't have to remain a virgin. I don't know why anybody would think that, other than making Mary a god, which is what some people try to do.
So, Tim, the $1 million question.
Are you giving me $1 million if I answer this right? Because if so, this is going to be our last podcast.
Yeah. Well,
we're going to do a podcast.
I'll have to collect donations.
Yeah.
Just give me time.
Yeah.
What did Mary know?
Are you trying to back me into a corner?
No,
well, sing a song.
Yeah. If you can sing. All right. So we know that there's a huge element of faith early on in the Gospels of Mary, recognizing her role that she's going into play. She's got this promise, but then you get a glimpse, and I don't want to jump too far ahead because we're going to talk about the brothers, but you get a glimpse to where early on it appears the brothers are not on board with where he is. I don't know if Mary's lumped into that as well when we get to Mark 6 here, but then we do see Mary at the cross, and later on, it seems to be a follower of Jesus, maybe before some of Jesus' siblings jump in. So what do you feel like from the text? What conclusions can we make? Can we make anything about how Mary views Jesus like throughout his ministry?
Well, we could definitely say from the message she was given by the angel, her son is the Messiah of Israel. Okay. Now, what were Mary's expectations of a Messiah? I don't think by any means she had a full understanding the minute that angel rattled that off that he's going to die on a cross and there's going to be this thing called a church and people are going to be baptized into it and all that. There's no way she knew all those things. She knew he was going to save the people from their sins. Well, does that mean you're going to take away God's judgment on Israel for the people sinning and remove the Roman yoke of hegemony over them? Or what does that mean? Typically being saved from people's sins and people being saved in the Old Testament Israelite Jewish mind is not what we think about being saved from our sins ultimately on a judgment day. But now she may very well have some kind of concept of that we know they had a concept of a judgment and things along the whether she had digested all that, I don't know. But I don't think there's any doubt in my mind. She knew that he was the Messiah of Israel. The question is, what does that mean? Was she expecting him to die on a cross when he was a little boy? I don't know about that. And did she believe, I guess at some point she heard Jesus say, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to be crucified by the Gentiles and we'll raise 3 days later. Maybe she heard that somewhere. I don't know that I could point to a place where she was in the audience, but I would imagine the disciples would be like, you know what Jesus is saying? I do think that as a mother, she might be concerned about Jesus' actions and what he's doing and him bucking the religious establishment, him traveling all these long ways around people that don't like him. He's making a little bit of trouble. I don't know what ramifications Jesus' actions had on the family in their community. He was rejected in his own hometown, he says, about Nazareth. But Capernaum, he seems to be pretty well liked. And so I don't know that they would have been ostracized just because they were related to Jesus. But how much she knew, my guess would be not much more than the disciples. And they didn't know a lot.
Yeah. Do we know much from it? And you may not know this. I don't. It just kind of hit me now. I didn't look it up beforehand. So it may be a no comment here, but do you know anything from the historical side of how Mary's viewed like after the Gospels?
I don't. I would have to look and see what's mentioned in what I would call apocryphal writings or in the apostolic fathers, how she's viewed or how she's mentioned or anything like that, or any kind of how she died. Obviously she was, keep in mind, if Jesus was around 30, Luke tells us, when he started his ministry, and we know from John's Passovers that he was in about 3 years of ministry, Mary may have only been in her late 40s. I mean, if she was 14 to 16 years old when she had Jesus, or maybe even she was 20, she was just barely 50. And so I don't know how she died. I don't know what happened to her after the cross. And did John do his job and take care of her? John lived a long time, the son of Zebedee did, but if tradition's correct, he moved to Ephesus at some point in time, and so maybe after she died or whatnot. But I don't know of any church tradition about Mary that we would find in Christian literature.
Okay.
I'd have to go look that up.
Yeah, I didn't know. Sometimes just random stuff,
No
so I figured I would ask. Yeah. All right, let's jump into his brothers here. Maybe let's flip over to Mark chapter 6. We got a couple of different references there that I think will be helpful. The first off, what if we start at, you already referenced the being a carpenter's son in verse 3 there. It also lists that he's got the brothers, 4 brothers, doesn't mention the sisters by name there in verse 3. Later on in verse 21, I lost my place. Hang on. Help me out, Tim.
I'm told you out,
this. Sorry. I went to the wrong chapter. That's why.
Okay.
In Mark chapter 3, that's what I meant for us to camp for a minute. In Mark chapter 3, verses 21, we have this reference to where, or I'll pick up in verse 20. And when he went home and the crowd gathered again so that they could not even eat, and when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying he is out of his mind. So one of the early references that I think we see to where his brothers kind of stand, like, to me, I see that as being they're not on pages like, okay, we're going to travel around and be some of the core leaders of what Jesus is trying to do here. Is that how you would see this being represented?
Yeah, I know we were talking before we started about who was saying he's out of his mind. I think the verb there carries the they. There's not a pronoun there, I don't think, in Greek. But I think it's his family saying he's out of his mind with what is going on. I don't think the crowd, because the crowd seems to like Jesus and coming to hear them and thinking about that. The things that he was saying, what he was doing, his ministry getting fired up here. I do think that they're like, what is going on?
Yeah, because this is right after he calls some of his apostles. So, like he's stepping into this role of being a rabbi here. Rabbi-like, figure.
A leader, a trainer of men and having disciples follow him,
and then we see, you want to read some, Tim? Maybe Mark 3:31. This is another interaction we have of...
Oh, yeah, this is one that we see recorded, I think, in Matthew and Luke as well. It says in verse 31, and his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him, and a crowd was sitting around him, and they said, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. I think Jesus is saying, here's my family, here's my people. Mm-hmm. For those whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. And of course, when we say, who are my mothers and brothers, that word brothers can mean sisters as well, can be inclusive of that. So, and then Jesus puts that in verse 35, we see the two Greek nouns, adelphos and adelphi, which is the masculine and feminine form of those words. So he is definitely referring and saying, whoever does God's will, he's our people, he's our family, he's my brother and sister and mother. It's a very strange thing for him to say, I think, to us, but I think that's the simple teaching that he's got there. But I may be wrong. I never studied this passage in depth.
Yeah. So we see that, to me, there's this painting of definitely they're skeptical, like they're confused. They're not like, being leaders of this mission yet. Mm-hmm. And then when I just think of where they're not mentioned, like they're not mentioned in Luke 10 when he sends out the 70 to preach. There's no indication that they're there at the Last Supper or that his siblings are there at the crucifixion. Like, it's really not until post-resurrection that we see his siblings come into the scope of like Christianity and being part of this belief and understanding of who Jesus is. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, there's a reference there. I'll read it here real quick. Over to it. Then he appeared to James and then to all the apostles. Tim, is it your understanding that this James that is mentioned here, the James that we find being the author of the book of James later, like, what's the odds that this is the same James being the brother of Jesus, where he appears to him and then later he becomes a leader in the church in Jerusalem there, being labeled one of the pillars, and then also the author of James? Walk us through that. Are we talking about the same person?
That's what traditionally was believed, and I think that tradition goes back a long way into early Christianity. You know, James is the English rendering of the word of the name Jacob in Hebrew, and Jacob in Jacob, I guess, in Greek. And so Jacob, pretty common name. And there's a lot of different Jameses there's James, the son of Zebedee. I think there's also another James that was a disciple of Christ. I think there's I think Judas's dad was named James. Obviously, probably a pretty popular name in Judaism. But traditionally and assuming that in Mark 6:3 and in Matthew 13:55, the brothers are listed in order of their birth after Jesus. James would have been the older. If it is, as tradition has, the same James that we see in Acts 15 as kind of the council leader in the mother church back in Jerusalem, that the whole appeal about circumcision and stuff is brought by Paul and Barnabas. Also, Paul references that same James in Galatians chapter 1 and Galatians 2. And then I think, as you mentioned, in 1 Corinthians 15, when he's talking about resurrection, he obviously, Peter, and he says, he appeared to the 12, which I assume includes Matthias, which is strange, because I don't think Matthias was selected until after Jesus ascended back into heaven. So when he says the 12, I don't know who all he's referring to, if he's just referring to the disciples as a whole, because technically there was only 11 of them because Judas was gone. But anyway, he appeared to the disciples. We see accounts of that at the ends of the gospel. But then I think James is singled out.
It mentions 500.
Yeah, a whole lot of people, and he appeared to James. And so that same James, if so, there's been a big shift in James to believing in Jesus. And at what point that happened, I don't know. Certainly we're post-resurrection here. And so if it is the same one, and it's also the same one that's the author of the general epistle with his namesake, Jesus' brother did some pretty big things. And some people think Judas, one of the other brothers who was named there, may be Jude, the author of that, because he calls himself the brother of James. Well, if it's the same James that we're talking about here, then that's the case. But there is discussion about that because it's not a common name. I told our men's class is studying James, and I told them, I really wish these people had more unique names. Like I wish Jesus' brother was Joachim or something like that. So the book of Joachim would have been like, oh yeah, there's no question. There's only so many people that had that name because he wasn't a good king. And so you might say, and maybe that's why nobody has that name, but I really wish they had more unique names. If Jesus' brother had been named, Zerubbabel or something, we could have a...
Yeah, and you may have mentioned this, I may have missed it, but like when you think of a writing like James that was more universal in writing, it wasn't like it was just going to one receiver of it. Like James would have had to have been a popular person that people knew without it actually describing anything other than just James.
Yeah, because he doesn't say that. He doesn't say, I, James, brother of Jesus Christ, the leader of the Jerusalem council.
I think he called himself a servant.
A servant of Jesus Christ, not a brother of him. And he never really even claims to be an apostle. He assumes authority, though. In the book, because all it is a list of commandments and ways to behave, there's an assumed authority there. And a recognized authority, I think, in whoever the recipients were. So I'm with you. And I think that's the case in a lot of ways, that the people that they know who's writing it. They recognize James. He doesn't have to explain himself. And obviously Paul explains himself as an apostle, a servant of Jesus Christ, or a slave of Jesus Christ. And so, yeah, I think he would be. And then when Paul mentions it, like when you said, when he rattles off James in Galatians 1 and Galatians 2, and that's all he says. He doesn't say James Smith there, or last name, or James the son of Joseph or something like. It's assumed that it's important that James saw the resurrected Lord. And you know what James I'm talking about. And that's a city all the way over in Greece somewhere. And so that tells us that name was recognized. And so I think it makes sense that it's the leader of the Jerusalem church and probably the brother of Jesus.
Yeah, for both of those there. So very interesting just to see, as long as those dots connect,
brothers, I don't know how,
how that developed, though, from where they were in Mark 3 to where, as long as the same James, where he ended up in Acts 15, so very interesting there. Anything else about brothers before we move on?
You have that one listing as one of the listing is Joseph or Joseph, and then I think Luke lists him, or excuse me, Matthew lists him as Joseph, and you have Jude or Judas, Simon, his sisters. We know they had wives, because Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 9:5, he's talking about, would it be okay for me to have a wife? Peter had a wife, and the brothers of our Lord had wives. So we know they were married. So Jesus probably had sister. We would call them sisters-in-law during his life. I would imagine they had children. Jesus, I think, had a big family, a big extended family here.
Yeah. And why reference Jesus' brothers if they're not followers or leaders? Like for that line of, for that line of like the argument that they're trying to make there, it's like, well, if they're not believers in the church, well, who cares?
We know from John 7 verses 3-5 that even his brothers didn't believe in him initially.
Yes, yeah.
But that's not unusual. There are a whole lot of people didn't believe in Jesus, and so we know they didn't. But at some point,
all the evidence points to they did. Yeah,
they did. Or at least Joseph, James, and Jude maybe.
Yeah. Those two. And one other comment: the order of the brothers is not always the same. Like you have James always being listed first, so most likely oldest, but the bottom of the list isn't always in the same order.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go to maybe extended family here real quick. What about John the Baptist here?
Yeah, I think we say this. We would say non-local extended family. We know he had a family around there in Capernaum, and these brothers and his sisters-in-laws, and maybe their children. But Elizabeth is described as a suganes, a relative, a kinswoman. Some English translations say cousin, but I think that's unfortunate because we have a very particular definition of cousin there, meaning it's my uncle's kids or my aunt's kids, and thinking about that, or my aunt's kids, if we think about second cousins. But it just means a kinswoman. And so, and she doesn't live in Nazareth. I went back, I got to look in, or Capernaum. Mary traveled to Judah to see her, not the city of Judah, but the area of Judah. So that's like further south, way further south than Nazareth, which is up in Galilee. Bethlehem, for example, which is far south of Galilee, of Nazareth, is in the region of Judah. And so they don't live nearby, but they are kin in some way. But I don't know what that means. I don't know if it's a first cousin, second cousin, eighth cousin, whatever that winds up being in that way. I don't know where they lived in particular. I looked at Zechariah's kind of narrative to see, but eventually John the Baptist is preaching down in the southern part of Judea near the Dead Sea and in the Jordan spilling into the Dead Sea. But I don't know where they live. But he had relatives spread out that he would have been kin to through his mama.
Yeah, I feel like, unless I'm overlooking something, Luke gives the best description of that interaction between Mary and Elizabeth. And stuff
the
there,
Magnificat and, Elizabeth's encounter and the baby leaping in her womb. I think, Luke is the one who gives us that.
Yeah. One other reference that we came across was John 19:25, which I don't know exactly how to read it per se, but it reads, "But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, and Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene."
Yeah, we were trying to figure out whether or not it doesn't name his mother, and then it says, and of course, commas are not in Greek. Commas are placed in the Greek text by later people, and so if we were just reading it straight on literally, it would say the mother, Jesus, his mother, and the sister of his mother, Maria of Clopas, and Maria the Magdalene. That would be a literal reading of me just sitting here reading it out of Greek. So is Mary the wife of Clopas, Jesus' mother's sister, so therefore Jesus' aunt? The only thing that would straighten, Mary's mother is Maria as well. I say Maria because that's a...
I was going to ask you to clarify that.
That's a Greek version of the Hebrew word Miriam, the sister of Moses. And so that's Mary's name in Hebrew. But Maria is the same name as Mary. Well, it would be strange I think that this is listing Jesus' mother, Jesus' aunt, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, meaning there's 4 women there. Now, because it would be strange if Mary's sister was also named Mary. Now, maybe so, but that would be one of those
stranger names than that.
I've seen stranger things, but when somebody had to chew out one of the kids, Mary, which one? Which one? So I don't know, and I don't know of any way it's possible to tell. Why that is, but some people would say that he had an aunt named Mary, and he also had a mama named Mary, which would be a challenging thing. So,
yeah.
So I'm.
But
not
what
sure.
we do know is there was an aunt present.
There was an aunt. He does have an aunt.
Yeah.
What her name is irrelevant. He also had an aunt, and look, in a place where people had large families, I bet Joseph wasn't an only child either. It'd be very unusual.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously Mary had all these boys and sisters. She had a lot of children. For Joseph to not have, Jesus might have had a lot of aunts and uncles. By the time we think about Joseph's kin, and I know they're not bloodline, but Joseph's brothers and sisters, Mary's brothers and sisters, if she had any more than just this, I mean, it's just a huge family group that Jesus was involved in. It's just interesting. It'd be so interesting to know any more of those interactions. Did they believe in him? Did his aunt believe in him? She's there at the cross. Is she just there to comfort her sister? What's going on with that? And so it's just interesting, amazing, just how human Jesus was. And I think we forget about that.
Yeah, as we wrap up here, I was going to ask you what your closing thought was, but I figured that's it right there.
Jesus was a real human being that had a real family. And he experienced the family situation. He experienced love. He experienced kinship. He experienced extended family. For 30 years, he's not doing ministry work. So we think about all his experiences. We think well, Jesus was never home. Well, he was around his family as best we can tell for 30 years. And so just think of all those experiences, sitting around, laughing, telling stories, sadness, going through tough times together. The humanity of Jesus is overlooked, I think, in Christian theology, or at least in our conversations, because we're so obsessed with his salvific work. I think we just forget he was a real person. Yeah,
last night I was teaching a class, and we're talking about Jesus being the high priest and just that ability to sympathize with us, of him coming and experiencing what we have experienced. There's so much power in that when we pray to God and we know that through Jesus, he understands these emotions and these experiences. And I just think of even that tension that he would have of early on here when his family doesn't grasp what he's trying to do there. There's a lot of emotions built into that. Yeah. And we at least see some success that points to that. But yeah, there's a lot there that he had to navigate in life as well. I also think it's interesting how much we don't know about those early years, but that's not the purpose of these writings. It's not just let me tell you an historical account of the life of Jesus. There's a purpose in these writings that is very much about theology and the salvation and God's fulfillment of these promises that go beyond just this nuclear family here.
And there was an interest in that in later versions of Christianity, for example, in Gnostic Christianity, when we have this infancy gospel of Thomas that does describe Jesus' childhood, but we're talking about a Jesus that turns other children into goats. And does all.
It's a wild read.
Yeah, I mean, it's people say, "Why is that not in the Bible?" Well, you go read it and you find out why it's not in the Bible. But obviously, it's interesting that somebody would write that, meaning there was an interest in Jesus' family history.
If you got any questions or suggestions for future topics, let us know by emailing us at podcast@mountjuliet.org. To our fellow students of Scripture, thank you for joining us for tech support. We hope you will join us next week.
This is a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ. You can find more personal growth resources like this one at mountjuliet.org/resources. The Mount Juliet Church of Christ exists to glorify God and make disciples by helping people grow in Christ, love one another, and serve others.